as you look back on 2020 and look forward in 2020, over 2021 and the years to follow, what are the big standout shifts that you see have happened from your vantage point?
COVID-19 has been obviously a huge disruptor. However, there have been other disruptors in the last 100 years. We had the Hong Kong flu in the late 60s. We had the Spanish flu back at right at the end of World War I. World War II was a huge disruptor. You had the war in Vietnam that rearranged kind of some of the political landscape of the world. So there's been the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fragmentation of the Soviet Union. So there, we need to put COVID-19 in perspective of history. It's had huge impact, but those of us who are older, which I think I'm older than you.
You know, women just do a better job for a bit.
This has been a huge disruptor, and within this generation, it's been the biggest disruptor. However, this generation is shorter than in the past. I remember in 2008, I'd just come back from serving my church for 2 years in Africa, and had just come back, and I was teaching at the university in an executive program in a hotel outside of the university proper. And I remember going out during the break and seeing the stock market drop 100 points every 5 minutes. I mean, it was incredible. And that was at least as dramatic in those 3 or 4 days where you saw the US and global economy just tank in a matter of days. That was a huge disruptor. So the point of that is that change is going to be a way of life. It always has been a way of life, and it's going to continue to be a way of life. You've seen the political chaos in the United States in the last 24 hours. You know, things that my generation could have never imagined.
Yes.
Having armed people storm the U.S. Capitol building, but on the other hand, and that's on one political side. On the other hand, the other political side has been burning Portland, burning Seattle. Yeah. So you see these huge disruptions occurring, and we look for a solution that's going to fix it, technological solution that's going to fix it. Well, it's been pointed out that the solution to COVID-19 will never be the perfect solution like we saw in the Salk vaccine relative to polio.
Yes.
You know, in the Salk vaccine, if you got that vaccine, you were almost 100% secure that you're never going to get polio. That's not going to happen with COVID-19.
Right.
The best estimates are it'll be 90% active, 90% effective, and some estimates are as low as 70%.
Yes.
So we need to put both the inflection points of change in perspective, but we also need to put the technological fixes in perspective. And the conclusion of both is we have to learn to live with uncertainty. And the firms that are able to do 2 or 3 things, I think. One is they need to have deep sensitivity to what's going on in their customers' headsets.
Yes.
They need to, and that's going to be deeper than in the past. You know, we have some terrible, terrible examples of companies that have fallen in love with technology.
Yes.
And have forgotten about user-friendly, making the technology user-friendly. That lack of understanding has destroyed Nokia.
Yes.
Almost destroyed Nokia, which at one time was one of the most effective mobile phone companies in the world.
Yes.
And it appears, at least based upon the reviews that I've read in my experience, is that Nokia engineers fell in love with their technology instead of making it user-friendly. Whereas Steve Jobs was just absolutely rabid. If it isn't easy to use, I don't want it, no matter how fancy it is.
Yes.
So we need to put, the first thing is we need to put technology in perspective and get back to the core basics and be able to have a deep understanding of what the markets will tolerate, where they're headed, and how to bring about the intersection of what will benefit the consumer at the least cost and the least complexity, and at the same time have push forward the boundaries and the borders of technology to improve the quality of life.
Yes.
So I think, having that ability to have that deep understanding. At the same time, it's not just deep understanding based upon that instinctive sense that Steve Jobs had relative to market changes, but also the role that technology plays in accessing and leveraging information has got to be a priority.
Again, to use the cliche, the trust economy, we used to talk about it from a customer centricity standpoint. I used to always say that, the Airbnb phenomenon, for example, is so symbolic of the trust economy. People open out their homes, etc., and statistics have suggested that it is right to do so, to believe in the inherent goodness of people. You will have stray cases of vandalism, etc., or whatever, but the whole trust economy is now turned inward as well, which was always meant to be. So the ask has become almost that of an ideal work environment where you will trust, you have no choice but to trust people, and as you very rightly said, to equip them with better training, with much greater and at the level of leaders to manage them from the perspective of truly measuring only outcome. I think at the moment we're going through the throes of the exact opposite, where hours are longer and longer, meetings are longer and longer, because as leaders try to come to grips with how to still be in and around their teams and people, that days are stretching. When I speak to groups of young teams in India, they're really frustrated because there is no end to work or start to work, and it's just constant, and it's, you can sense that it is probably, one, you don't know where the darn market is going for your business in most cases, so you're worried in any case. And the second is the leader understands that his way of functioning or her way of functioning is no longer working, so they keep loading on more to try to control. So it's really a difficult time, and so the other corollary to my mind of what you said is that there cannot be a trust deficit in teams, because that's just going to implode everything.
I think you're framing the current situation, the current context in terms of trust, I think is very powerful. In the past, I would have said very strongly with a great deal of passion, trust is not an input, it's an output. Trust is something that's earned, it's not given. Even the strongest of trust-oriented HR departments would say, well, we have to trust our people. No, you don't. You don't inherently trust people. You spend huge number of hours screening, testing, interviewing before you hire somebody. You don't just say, come on in because I trust you. No, you have to prove to yourself that this person can be trusted. So this idea that trust is a given, I think is not accurate. Trust is something that is, at least historically, has been earned, and you trust because you can verify. Now, but you rake the point accurately but in today's world of an input, in addition to being an output that's earned. But I think what will happen as a result, that if people do not perform, if they do not contribute, then I think the tolerance for non-performance will go down.
Absolutely.
And so trust may be mandated, but if people violate that trust, by not working hard, by not performing at home, whether
Yeah.
even with the kids yelling in the background, or your husband or wife saying, the plumbing's leaking or whatever it is,
Yeah.
regardless of what it is, if you don't perform, then I think there's going to be a sharper edge of severance of trust than there has been in the past, because you just don't know. If people violate the trust, then you don't have time to coddle them and to figure out why and to be empathetic and stuff.
Yes.
If you don't perform, if you don't meet your commitments, if you don't contribute, then you'll have to go to another company.
This, and equally, what are your recommendations? What's the need of the hour for HR? Where do you see that? And then I want to pinpoint also what chief executives and boards need to be doing and thinking, and how you see that playing out.
Okay, I've heard you. I've heard you. You enunciate kind of three topics. So measurement, HR's role in the current business environment, and the role of leaders, senior leaders, and boards.
Yes.
So let me address those in order. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So measurement. There's two ways of two things you can use to measure whether people are contributing. You can watch their behavior, or you can measure their outputs. Those are the only alternate. Well, no, that actually I'm setting up a foil a little bit. So if you are so you can measure behavior, or you can measure output. And different job profiles require different measurement schemes.
Yeah.
So, for example, on my flight back from the West Coast to the university here, the cabin crew attendants, you don't measure their output. I don't even know what it would mean to measure the output. At the end of the flight, the pilot says, ask every passenger, did you like this? Did you like the cabin attendant? They don't do that. What happens is the lead cabin attendant watches the behavior of the other cabin attendants, and so they're watching behavior, and that becomes the basis for measurement. On the other hand, if you are a salesperson, where you don't, the sales manager doesn't go with the salesperson to every B2B stop that the salesperson makes to see if they're being friendly and happy. No, at the end of the week they say, did you sell stuff?
Yeah.
So you can measure both behavior, or you can measure output, and different job categories require different forms of measurement. Now, and some jobs allow you to do both. An assembly line worker, you can both watch the behavior and you can measure the output. What becomes more interesting is when certain jobs, it's difficult to measure behavior because you can't watch it, but it's also difficult to measure output. And that's it. And in a world where we're moving more towards soft skills or intellectual intangibles as the basis for economic value added, you can't watch somebody thinking, and it may take days, months, or years before there's an output for that thinking. So that's the intellectual question. What do you do when you can't measure output in the short run, and you can't measure behavior at all in a way that's relevant?
Yeah.
And that's the intellectual challenge for measurement today. Is what do you do when you can't measure output and you can't measure? Well, what historically has been done, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out in the future. Let me give an example. When the DNA helix was conceptualized by Guido and Cricks had gone to watch a movie in the local theater in Oxford, or not Oxford, Cambridge. People from Oxford be irritated with that. at Cambridge, and he was sitting in a theater watching a Laurel and Hardy movie in the middle of the afternoon, and he dozed off, and when he woke up, he had that moment of realization: the DNA is a double helix, and he got it, and he ran. Now, if you were his boss, he's sitting in a theater in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of the week, you'd say, "This guy's an idiot. I'm going to fire him. Look at his behavior." On the other hand, he's working for years on this issue, and it's taken years, and there hasn't been any output. And yet, in that moment, he made one of the most important discoveries of this century. So, and that's what we're facing now, where supervisors can't watch behavior, and it's more difficult to, especially in a world of intellectual contribution, to measure in short time periods people's abilities or their contributions. So I don't know the answer to that, but I'm saying that it is a major intellectual problem for HR. So what do? That means you have to sharpen your listening skills. You need to be able to understand their work. Leaders need to understand the work of their people much more closely than they have in the past. They can't just rely upon outputs at the end of a quarter, or this silly thing that we call annual performance evaluations that become totally meaningless in today's intellectually rich environment. We just don't know if somebody's contributed this year. The contributions may not be seen for years to come. At the same time, you can't measure the output. So that's the conundrum for measurement. And the companies need to simply spend more intellectual time and effort trying to understand the measurements at both the behavior and the output level, recognizing the weakness of both. And the companies that have HR folks, and let's move to HR. HR folks usually don't understand the core nature of the work well enough to be able to develop measurement systems that are more accurate than those of their competitors.
There's been so much talk over the years about businesses that choose to be customer centric and businesses that choose to be employee centric, almost as though these were two different buckets. Do you have a perspective on how these two actually marry? In my view, there is no either or, but there is so much literature around it. If you would provide an opinion in the context of these times on this. And secondly, basis that, I'd like you to move the conversation to what you now expect chief executives and leaders to do in terms of prioritization.
The question you have to ask yourself is, who at the end of the day decides if your company's going to live or die? And it's not whether your employees are happy, it's whether the customers, here's my wallet. It's whether your customer is going to take their wallets out of their pockets, take money out of their wallets and put it in your pockets and not your competitors.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, your customers will decide if you're going to succeed or not, if you're going to exist or not. And therefore, if a company has a high ability to do something, that is, has a high level of supply, but they're doing things that the marketplace doesn't require, that is, there's low demand. It's basic economics.
Yes.
If you have high supply and there's no demand, what's the economic value? It's not low, it's zero. And sometimes we in HR, and I'm an HR professional. I've been an HR professional for 45 years. So, I am deeply committed and extraordinarily enthusiastic about the potential power and contribution that HR can make. But that contribution can only occur if it starts with an understanding of what kind of a workforce, what kind of a culture, what kind of technical capabilities, what kind of skills, knowledge, experience we have that will help that company to meet the requirements of its customers better than the competition, period.
Mm.
And if you have the concept of happy employees is really kind of a silly concept, because if they're not happy making customers happy, then they're part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. So happiness is a neutral. The question is what makes them happy.
Yes.
If they're happy coming in late and leaving early, that's part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. So the fact they're happy is irrelevant. The question is, what are they happy doing? Are they happy doing the things that the marketplace requires for the organization to be successful?
Yes. Yes.
So,
what do you think they should be demanding from their companies? We've talked about consumers. What are you seeing some of the most successful companies do as they look forward, both at the level of the board and at the level of executive leadership?
Okay. Let me frame it at three levels.
Mm-hmm.
First level is, I had the opportunity of working with Texas Instruments several years ago. You know, they've become just this fabulous company. You know, they're the inventors of 3D, and they're now moving toward holographic imaging, and it's just a wonderful company. The CEO at the time said something that I really value. He said, good, successful companies usually don't die by major catastrophes. He calls them, he said, it's death by ducks. D-U-C-K. Say, large successful companies die as a result of not one great big bite, but a little nibble here, a nibble, and after 10,000 nibbles, they die. It's death by ducks. I think that's a great term. And so that gives senior leaders the mandate to deeply understand what's happening in the core of their company. Our incentives driving, if most people don't come to work saying, what can I do to destroy my company today? But you look around what sometimes people do, you say, why would you do something? That's stupid. Why would you do that? And it almost always goes back to what they're being measured on, what they're being rewarded for, what messages their leaders are sending. And so leaders need to understand deeply what is going on in the depths of their organizations. And they can't rely upon what their immediate subordinates are saying or what their subordinates are saying. They need to go around management by walking around. And they need to understand kind of what's going on in the core of their people. Now, in today's world, that's much more problematic, where we're dealing with more virtual-based interaction with people. In fact, just as a side note, I interviewed a senior executive in one of the leading financial institutions in the world, just as the pandemic was breaking. He said the biggest problem that he was facing is his ability to mentor was falling apart, because he used to mentor by walking through the office and just randomly, on the basis of instinct, going over to a young, high potential individual. So how are you doing today? What are you working on? Oh, really? Have you thought about working out this way? And he'd mentor them real time. Now he can't see them. And you know, and so the mandate for leaders to understand deeply kind of what's going on in the hearts and minds and capabilities, skills and experience, motivations, drives, desires, and purpose of their employees is going to be more important. So that's more of a micro view, to get deep in understanding what's going on in their businesses, to avoid death by ducks. Okay. The second issue is to be able to recognize and make a split in appreciation for complexity. internal complexity can be a problem, and it tends to be a problem when systems, processes, procedures, rules, practices become complex. Then people get lost. So keeping internal things focused and disciplined is important. Complexity on the outside can be both a problem and a solution. And I think in one of your questions that you sent me earlier, you kind of enunciated that. Complexity on the outside is a function of sectors moving and changing, and geography sector moving and changing. So the movement of sectors overlaid on movement by geographies. Yeah, let me give you an example. The United States is collapsing into itself. Britain is collapsing into itself. China and India are expanding out in themselves. So there's that geographical dynamic. Sector boundaries are shifting. The way we talked about earlier, Amazon's now competing with Walmart. General Motors now is being attacked by Google. So the sector boundaries are breaking down. So those dynamics are occurring at an ever faster rate. So that creates pockets of opportunity. And the ability of companies to recognize where those pockets are, go in and leverage those pockets, and then pull out before those windows of competitive advantage close is going to be critical. So that means that senior leaders need to understand intimately what's going on in those sector and geographic dynamics, so they can identify those pockets of opportunity, move in and get out. And companies that can do that will survive and prosper. Those that don't will not. And that puts heavy burden, intellectual burden, on leaders not to manage the status quo into the future, but to recognize the importance of institutional agility, speed, and flexibility. Okay, and that has to be done by leaders. And finally, the last issue is, so you have that micro view, you have the heavy macro view, but then in the middle, the question is, how do you make the whole greater than the sum of the parts? How do you bring this break down the silos between individuals, between teams, between departments, between divisions, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? By learning at the individual level, learning at the team level, I didn't say that right. But learning across individuals, learning across teams, learning across departments, learning across divisions, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So, and that becomes a cultural issue, not necessarily a technical issue. So in this world of the future, leaders are going to have to be much more skilled at managing the total past. Although a lot of companies do that. And then India has some wonderful examples of institutions that have effectively managed their cultures. So you have the macro view, the micro view of individuals, the macro view of complexity, and the intermediate view of creating the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts. And leaders need to pay attention at all three levels. That makes sense? I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. It just makes, it's what defines leaders. And I think that, what you've mentioned, their measurement now at the level of leadership and how they're actually going to be able to achieve this at all three levels, particularly in times when markets are going to be so demanding as they shift and transform. It's all too easy to stay focused on the tactic of simply staying atop the tiger, as it were. And therefore being able to have this ability to step back. And boards themselves must be able to guide, and you said mentoring. I think people like you who have guided business leaders over decades now will pay the greatest service to it.
Don't I wish it was only a decade? How about 4 decades?
Over decades, yes, that's what I said.
Thank
Over
you.
decades.
You're being very kind.
But will now do the greatest service to be able to actually push this through. We'll have to wait to see. Do you think, as we sign off, Wayne, do you think that we said it right at the beginning that people are creatures of habit, and you will see at the level of sectors, you will see this big jump and resurgence in many areas where there is little happening as things move to safer ground, maybe in 2 years or 2.5. I don't know. I hesitate to put a timeline. You don't say when, you could say what. But do you think that the shifts that we have spoken of and the demand of businesses that you have highlighted and raised, is that here to stay if we were to take a punt? Or when easier times come, will we slip back into the more humdrum way of looking at things?
Well, I'm hoping that. Well, no, over in my 130 trips to India, I've since 1994. 1994. Before 1994, I'd never been to India. And one of your colleagues and one of my dear friends named C.K. Prahalad, who passed away, as you know, about 5 years ago, he was a professor at the University of Michigan. He invited me to go to India in 1994. He said, wherever you're, at that time I was focused primarily in Europe and China. He said, China and Europe, if you want to go someplace exciting, come with me to India. So he invited me to work with some companies on consulting projects and doing some teaching in India. During those years since 1994, I've seen India work aggressively to be able to integrate the country and leverage the potential intellectual and practical contributions of people throughout the society, regardless of age, gender, nutrition, social class, ethnicity, whatever it might be. And during the pandemic, my fear is that India might be subjected to the dynamics of isolation, of fragmentation that it hasn't experienced in the past. Before, there's been a movement to bring things together, to integrate, coordinate, and to create synthesis. And during the pandemic, there may have been some evidence. Well, there is evidence of isolation. Yes. The question is, will that break down and inhibit India from leveraging that integrative capability that it's developed over the last 25 years? That would be my if I were to speak to board of directors of India's leading companies, that would be my message, is how do you make sure that the isolation that has been brought about by the pandemic doesn't undo 25 years of integration and working together.